Okay, welcome back to members of a 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and to our ongoing study in Teilhard de Chardin and his Phenomenon of Man, his magnum opus. We're going to take a look at pages 71 to 81, and we're going to subtitle this lesson, Creation and Carporphoria. In the Greek New Testament, carporphoria is fruit-bearing, and this is all about creation and the inner within to bear fruit, to bear the advent of life. Creation and carporphoria, creation and fruit-bearing. And this fruit-bearing comes about, says Teilhard, through an inner aspect to all of creation. From the very inception of creation, there was always an inner aspect. And that inner aspect has always been spiritual energy. Now, in the New Testament, spiritual energy has two names. It's Dunamis, for potentiality of spiritual energy, and Energia as actualization of spiritual energy. But Teilhard was one of the very first theologians to ever teach that at the very beginning of creation, all of created matter had an inner aspect, and that inner aspect was, is, and remains spiritual energy. And so we're going to see how that evolved and how it resulted in the fruit bearing of the advent of life. Let's go to block 1. Creation and the primitive within. The involution of the within of the earth, or the psychic face, the psychic identity of the earth. The exterior world has always been lined with an interior world. The matter curled around itself and became a closed volume. Therefore, the inner aspect, that spiritual within, must react to this enclosure, the shrinkage. Block 1, note 2, the reaction of the within of the earth. At creation, there was a certain mass of elementary consciousness that was imprisoned in the matter of the earth from the very beginning. It was a early principle of carporphoria, fruitfulness. Creation has always had a early principle of fruitfulness, a early principle of carporphoria, which Teilhard calls it the inner principle of consciousness that was carried within. He calls it a kind of consciousness. Later he just kind of sticks with the term spiritual energy, but he will alternate back and forth on that. Sometimes they'll call it primitive consciousness, sometimes spiritual energy. Let's go to block 1 and note 3. As an essential elastic quantum, the within of the earth exists and has existed in a primitive state. Then began the first phases of psychical evolution and its participation in spiritual energia. So we begin with the triad, the involution, the curling of earth in on itself, and the shrinkage of that inner aspect. And then we have the elementary principle of consciousness and carporphoria. And then we have that early consciousness existing as a primitive elastic quantum of energy, an actual elastic, meaning that it is available to be actualized, quantum of Dunamis, potentiality of energy. Let's go to block 2. We're going to talk about those two terms. Spiritual energy transitions from potentiality of dunamis to actualization of energia. In the New Testament, Teilhard understood these two terms. You should understand these two terms, okay? If you come across dunamis in Paul or any of the gospel writers, dunamis is potentiality of spirit. Always. Dunamis is potentiality of spirit. When it becomes actual, when it becomes awakened, it becomes energia. But it begins as dunamis. Dunamis potentiality becomes awakened and actualized to become energia. So block 2, note 1, the potentiality of dunamis. As the complexity of elements do increase, they do become chain-like in their structures, and this creates that state of spiritual potentiality, the state of dunamis. Whenever you get these chain-like structures of existence. Now, how is it actualized? Block 2, note 2. It is first awakened in a new synthesis of matter. And that happens because there is a proto-internal freedom present in creation at the level of microscopic proteins. And they will rise up, and it does end up creating a biosphere on the Earth's surface. A primordial state of consciousness does emerge in this biosphere. So we have the block 2, note 3, the torpor or potentiality of dunamis. He calls it torpor, I don't care, potentiality. We have the torpor of dunamis and the primordial internal freedom to awaken that potentiality, which does result in an elementary energia as an elementary inner consciousness. The growth of elementary freedom is attributed to the growing structure of molecular chains, all within that closed surface of substance. Emerging up from the coiling up of the earth upon itself, we have these primordial centers of the chain-like structures. There is always a primitive spiritual energy to all matter from the very inception of creation, says Teilhard. There's always a potential, not actualized, but there's a potentiality of spiritual energy as an internal aspect to all matter. But it does eventually evolve into a biosphere, and out of that biosphere, we have the next step of the evolving advent of life, block 3. Dunamis becomes energia actualization, and we have the advent of life. This is a huge transition for Teilhard. Energia, from the latent germinal powers of the earth, living protoplasm emerge from these chain-like structured proteins. There's evidence of an early elementary psyche. Being always has a cosmic embryogenesis. Teilhard says and posits that creation always has an internal aspect as a cosmic embryogenesis of a elementary consciousness, an elementary psyche, a psychical beginning. Very primitive, but still, it's there. Then, block 3, note 2, the advent of life. There have been change of state jumps in evolution. That's why we believe in a creator God. The amazing profusion of organic matter. The emergence of the complexity of a biosphere, and the details of this emerging biosphere science cannot reconstruct. Materialistic science cannot answer it. That's why Teilhard always promotes a science of phenomenology, because phenomenology does not ignore the inner aspect. Phenomenology does address the inner aspect of all externality, all matter. The details of this emergence science cannot reconstruct. The self is the natural granule of life, but the cell is the outcome of a long creative preparation by God, the creative process by God the Father. The cell, when it does emerge, it has been a long cosmic embryogenesis and a long preparation to bring about the emergence of the cell in the biosphere. So in this lesson, we get tremendous help. We get block one, the creation of a creation that includes always, from the very beginning, a primitive within internal aspect. Always. That internal aspect evolves to become the early transition of spiritual energy. It begins as potentiality of Dunamis, and then it becomes the actualization as Energia, block 2. And out of that transition from Dunamis to Energia, we find the evolving biosphere and eventually the advent of cell life. Cellular life does evolve in the biosphere. And that is a movement from Dunamis to Energia. It's all about, for Teilhard, life is all about energy, spiritual energy. Creation, from the very beginning, has always included an inner aspect. Yes, we've had the matter, the stuff of existence, and that has never been the essential real, says Teilhard. Never. Surface reality has never been the genuine reality. It has been the matter of creation, the physicality of creation, but what genuinely matters for us is the inner aspect. And for Teilhard, from the very beginning of creation, all matter has had an inner aspect of spiritual energy. What is this spiritual energy? Well, it begins in a very primitive state, but it's there. At the very beginning of creation, there was even a primitive psychical beginning at the microscopic level, but it was there. At the microscopic level, but it was there. It has gone through year after year after year of creative evolution by the Creator God, eventually becoming the movement of the Dunamis potentiality of energy to becoming the Energia actualization of spiritual energy and the creation of a biosphere. And then within that biosphere, we have the emerging advent of life as cellular life. The advent of life as cellular miraculous life. And it's a miracle. It's a created miracle. It's a jump. There have been change of state jumps in evolution, says Teilhard. And those are creative jumps. Change of state jumps have taken place from that primitive internal aspect to the actual transition of Dunamis to Energia, and then from Dunamis to Energia to biosphere, and then from biosphere to the advent of life as the miracle of emerging cellular life. All of this is critically important, and as a recap, we're going to go to block 2 because that's huge, okay? The potentiality of Dunamis. As the complexity of elements increase, the elements evolve to become chain-like structures. Then we have the potentiality of Dunamis as our spiritual energy. Actuality of Energia first is awakened in a new synthesis of matter through a rising up of a proto-internal freedom created by God the Father. It's at the microscopic level of proteins layered on the Earth's surface, where eventually we have a biosphere and a very primordial state of consciousness emerges. Very, very primordial state, but still, this primitive, elementary state of consciousness emerges. Then we have in Block 2, Note 3, the torpor or potentiality of Dunamis and the primordial internal freedom result in an elementary inner consciousness. The growth of elementary freedom is attributed to the growing structures of molecular chains within the surface of substance. Then emerging up through this coiling up of the earth on itself, we have the primordial infinite centers of these chain-like structures, which are primordial states of psychical consciousness. So you've got these very primitive chain-like structures that develop in existence, and those chain-like structures, their psychical center is a very primordial state of psychical consciousness, says Teilhard. Out of this primitive, elementary, psychical consciousness, we have energy actualization and the advent of cellular life, and along with that physical cellular life, we have the evolving psychical evolution of life. Cellular life is in a parallel movement of complexity along with psychical life. Cellular life and psychical life both proceed in their own evolutionary process, side by side, increasing in complexity, moving toward the omega point of Jesus Christ, Lord of all creation. The omega point, our phenomenon of the eschatological future, is the image of Christ. He is the horizon toward which these cellular and psychical evolutionary chains are moving. They are moving in increased complexity, and there will be finally the complexity that evolves to the eschatological convergence in the omega point of Jesus Christ, Lord of all creation. Tremendous lesson. That wraps up 71 to 81. Next lesson, we're going to move into the realm of thought. Next lesson, we will move into the realm of thought.